In Copenhagen, in the years after the First World War, mothers often faced impossible choices. Poverty was crushing, social stigma was unforgiving, and many women found themselves unable to care for their children. In those desperate times, a trusted neighbor, a woman willing to watch over infants and arrange adoptions, could seem like a blessing. But for some mothers, that trust would become a death sentence. Dagmar Overbye was one such woman. To her community, she appeared ordinary, a quiet figure in the background of city life. She was a babysitter, a caretaker, someone who held out her arms and promised to nurture what others could not. But beneath that facade lay a darkness so profound it would leave Denmark horrified. Between 1913 and 1920, she is believed to have murdered as many as 25 children, most of them infants, some only days old. 9 of those murders were proven in court. The others remain haunting suspicions, whispered through the records of a city that struggled to comprehend what she had done. This was not a crime of passion, nor a single moment of madness. It was systematic, cold, repeated. Dagmar exploited the most sacred bond of all, a mother's love and desperation, turning it into opportunity for death. At the time, infant mortality in Europe was high. It was not uncommon for children to die from disease, malnutrition, or neglect. But Dagmar's acts were not the tragedies of circumstance. They were deliberate. Infants were strangled, drowned, even burned in her stove, their cries silenced forever. To this day, she remains one of Denmark's most infamous criminals, a woman whose betrayal of trust left scars not only on grieving parents but on the very laws that govern childcare in the country. This is the story of Dagmar Overbye, the babysitter who murdered innocents. Before we dive in today's historical serial killers documentary, let everyone know from where you are watching and what time it is there. It is a story of desperation, betrayal, and the dark places humanity can sink when trust is broken and life is devalued. And it begins, not with the murders, but with the girl who would grow into one of Europe's most chilling serial killers. To understand how a woman could commit such unspeakable acts, we must first step back to where her story began. Dagmar Johanna Amalie Overbye was born on April 23, 1887, in Denmark. Like so many children of her generation, she came into a world of hardship. Her family was poor, living in the rural outskirts where survival itself was a daily task. Denmark in the late 19th century was a nation caught between the old world and the new. Industrial growth was reshaping the cities. But in the countryside, families still labored under the weight of poverty and tradition. Little is known about Dagmar's childhood in detail, but what we do know paints a grim picture. Accounts suggest she grew up in a strict and unforgiving household. Poverty meant food was scarce, and affection scarcer still. Children in such families were often treated more as laborers than as cherished sons or daughters. In this environment, Dagmar learned early the harshness of life, the indifference of the world toward suffering. Some later speculated that Dagmar herself had been a victim of abandonment, perhaps neglected emotionally, perhaps even physically abused. While the records cannot prove this, criminologists have often pointed out that childhood trauma can play a devastating role in shaping the psychology of future offenders. If love is absent in the earliest years, empathy, that essential human bond, may never fully develop. As Dagmar grew, she found work where she could. Like many young women of her class, opportunities were limited: domestic service, factory work, or caregiving. She drifted into roles where she looked after others, particularly children. On the surface, she seemed reliable, quiet, even motherly. In a society where appearances mattered, Dagmar carried herself as a woman of modest respectability. Neighbors saw nothing sinister, nothing to make them turn away. In her early adulthood, Dagmar formed relationships that were strained and unstable. One affair reportedly ended in betrayal, leaving her abandoned and bitter. Another ended in tragedy. Her own child, born out of wedlock, is believed to have died under unclear circumstances. Some historians suggest this was the turning point, the moment where grief and resentment twisted into something darker. Whether through accident, neglect, or intent, that child's death may have marked the beginning of Dagmar's detachment from the sanctity of infant life. By her late 20s, Dagmar was living in Copenhagen, the Danish capital. The city was bustling, full of opportunity but also full of desperation. For women without stable husbands or families, survival depended on odd jobs, on services that others were too busy or too burdened to provide. Babysitting, child-minding, or arranging informal adoptions became Dagmar's way of earning. She was not alone. Countless women across Europe acted as unofficial guardians, taking in unwanted or illegitimate children. To most who met her, Dagmar did not stand out. She blended into her surroundings, presenting herself as a respectable, even trustworthy woman. She understood the needs of vulnerable mothers. She spoke the right words, offered the right reassurances. She knew how to calm their fears, and above all, she knew how desperately they needed someone like her. It was this mask of normalcy, this ability to appear harmless, that would later allow her to commit crimes so shocking that Denmark would struggle to comprehend them. Dagmar Overbye's early life was shaped by hardship, secrecy, and perhaps loss. These seeds, planted in childhood, would one day bloom into something monstrous. But in the years before the First World War, no one could have predicted that this ordinary woman would become one of history's most notorious child killers. To understand how Dagmar Overbye was able to commit her crimes, we must first understand the society that enabled her. Copenhagen in the early 20th century was a city of contrasts. On one side, it was modernizing rapidly, factories rising, trams running, workers filling the streets. On the other, it was a place of poverty and moral judgment, especially for women who bore children outside of marriage. Unwed mothers carried a heavy burden. In the eyes of the church, in the whispers of neighbors, and even in the law itself, illegitimacy was a stain. For many young women, being discovered as an unwed mother meant shame, ruined prospects, and a lifetime of social exclusion. Families often disowned daughters who returned home pregnant. Employers turned them away, and without support, survival became nearly impossible. For these women, options were few. Some abandoned their children in secrecy. Others turned to the practice known as baby farming. Baby farming was widespread not only in Denmark but across Europe. Women, often poor themselves, would take in infants for payment. Some promised to raise them, others promised to arrange adoptions. At times, the system worked, but more often, it became a transaction of desperation. A mother handing over her child to a stranger, hoping for mercy, but knowing little about what fate awaited. It was in this climate that Dagmar thrived. She knew the shame these mothers felt. She knew how to speak gently, how to assure them that their babies would be cared for, or placed with families who could provide better lives. In exchange, the mothers gave her money, sometimes all they had, and most importantly, they gave her their trust. In a world where infant mortality was already tragically common, suspicion was slow to rise. Diseases like tuberculosis, influenza, and malnutrition claimed countless young lives. When a baby disappeared from Dagmar's care, it was easy to assume tragedy rather than treachery. Death certificates were not always required. Oversight was minimal. And in a society reluctant to question a seemingly respectable woman, Dagmar operated with little scrutiny. Neighbors saw her as ordinary. Mothers saw her as a solution. And the authorities, overwhelmed by poverty and the daily struggles of the city, rarely asked questions about the quiet comings and goings of infants in her small apartment. Trust was her weapon. Society itself had handed it to her. And because of that, she could continue her crimes, one child after another, without anyone realizing the scope of what was happening. Dagmar Overbye was not an isolated monster. She was the product of a system that abandoned its most vulnerable, women trapped by stigma and children too small to defend themselves. And it was precisely in that blind spot that her cruelty took root. For those who handed over their children, it was meant to be a new beginning. But for many, it became the end of a very small and fragile life. And as the years passed, the scale of Dagmar's crimes would grow. The woman trusted with innocence would reveal herself to be a destroyer of it. By the late 1910s, Dagmar Overbye had established herself as a caretaker. Mothers who could not raise their children, many unmarried, many desperate, brought their infants to her modest home in Copenhagen. Some handed over coins, some simply pleaded for help. To them, Dagmar represented safety, a chance for their children to survive when society had turned its back. But once the door closed behind them, those infants were in the hands of a woman who had no intention of keeping her promises. The murders began quietly. A mother would leave her baby with Dagmar, expecting adoption or long-term care. Hours later, when the mother was gone, Dagmar acted. Her methods were horrifying in their simplicity. She would strangle the child with a piece of cord or her bare hands. In other cases, she held the infant under water until the crying stopped, and when she wanted to erase all evidence, she placed the small bodies in her stove, burning them until only ashes remained. The scale of these crimes is still uncertain. In court, 9 murders were proven beyond doubt. But investigators suspected many more. Perhaps as many as 25 children lost their lives to her hands. The precise number may never be known. What is known is that Dagmar killed with chilling regularity. Imagine the scene. A young mother, ashamed, tearfully kissing her child goodbye, whispering promises of a better life. She places the baby in Dagmar's arms, never suspecting it will be the last time she will ever see her child alive. Hours later, the apartment is silent, except for the crackling of flames or the sound of water filling a basin. Neighbors, over time, began to notice odd details, a strange smell coming from her chimney, the sight of bundles being carried in, but never back out. Some recalled hearing babies crying inside her home, only for the cries to vanish suddenly, replaced by silence. Yet no one imagined the truth. Poverty made tragedies common. And who would accuse a woman who presented herself as a caretaker? Dagmar's ability to kill without detection lay not only in her methods, but in her timing. Infant mortality was already so high in Denmark that a missing child could easily be explained away as death from illness or as an adoption arranged quietly. Mothers, already shamed by their circumstances, rarely questioned her or pressed for proof. To admit they had given their baby to a stranger was, in itself, a confession of desperation. Her crimes reveal not just cruelty, but calculation. By burning the remains of many victims, she left investigators with almost nothing to trace. When she did not burn the bodies, she concealed them in hidden places, under floorboards, in the stove, even tucked away in parcels. These methods suggest not only a lack of remorse, but an unsettling efficiency. What motivated Dagmar remains debated. Was it financial? Some argue she saw children as burdens she could profit from, taking payment from mothers and then eliminating the cost of raising the infants. Others point to deeper psychological issues, resentment toward her own lost child, bitterness at society, or perhaps a cold, sadistic detachment from human life. Whatever her reasons, the murders continued for years. Each victim was small, voiceless, and entirely dependent on the woman who should have protected them. Each life ended before it truly began. And all the while, Dagmar moved through her community with calm ordinariness. She shopped at markets. She greeted neighbors. She carried herself as a woman with nothing to hide, but evil has a way of leaving traces. And by 1920, suspicion was beginning to grow. A mother, unlike so many others, refused to be silent when her baby went missing under Dagmar's care. And with her determination, the facade Dagmar had carefully built began to crumble. The murders had gone unnoticed for years, but now the truth was about to come to light, and what investigators would find inside Dagmar Overbye's home would shock Denmark to its core. For years, Dagmar Overbye's crimes went unnoticed. Babies came and went from her small Copenhagen home, and in a society where death was common, no one questioned too closely what became of them. But in 1920, everything changed. A mother named Karen, desperate yet hopeful, entrusted her infant daughter to Dagmar. She had been promised the child would be placed in adoption, given a future free from stigma. But when Karen returned for news, Dagmar stalled. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually, Dagmar claimed she had handed the child to another woman who intended to raise her. But Karen was unconvinced. Something in Dagmar's calm, evasive answers did not sit right. Unlike so many before her, Karen refused to let the matter rest. She went to the police and reported her child missing. It was a bold move for an unmarried mother in that era, risking public shame, risking questions she feared answering. But her determination to find her daughter outweighed her fear of judgment. Police began to investigate. At first, Dagmar stuck to her story. She claimed she had arranged for the baby to be adopted, insisting she had done nothing wrong. But detectives pressed further. Witnesses were interviewed, neighbors came forward, and soon, cracks appeared in her tale. When officers searched Dagmar's apartment, they found chilling evidence. In her stove, hidden among the ashes, were fragments no one could mistake. Small bones, charred skulls, the unmistakable remains of children. In other parts of the home, more evidence surfaced. Tiny items belonging to infants, and traces of bodies hastily concealed. The investigators were horrified. This was not the work of a negligent caregiver. This was murder, deliberate and repeated. Neighbors gave statements that deepened the case. Some recalled a strange odor drifting from Dagmar's chimney, heavy and acrid. Others remembered seeing her carry bundles into the house late at night, only for no child to ever emerge again. One even spoke of hearing the pitiful cries of a baby abruptly cut off, replaced by silence. What had long been suspicion now became undeniable fact. News spread quickly. The Copenhagen press exploded with headlines. The public, already struggling through economic hardship and social upheaval, was stunned. To many, the idea that a woman, a supposed mother figure, could kill children so coldly was unthinkable. She was labeled the baby killer of Copenhagen. Mothers wept openly in the streets as rumors swirled of how many infants had been lost. When questioned further, Dagmar offered little remorse. Some reports suggest she confessed in part, admitting to several killings, while denying others. At times she seemed calm, almost detached, as if the gravity of her actions barely touched her. For investigators, it was chilling. The authorities compiled their case. At least 9 murders could be proven with physical evidence and testimony, but they suspected far more. Estimates ranged as high as 25 victims, though some believed even that number might be an understatement. By late 1920, Dagmar was arrested formally and charged. She was placed in custody, awaiting trial. Copenhagen, and indeed all of Denmark, waited anxiously for the proceedings. This was no ordinary criminal case. This was a reckoning, not only with the deeds of one woman, but with the very systems that had allowed her crimes to continue unchecked. The trial that followed would be among the most infamous in Danish history. And as the evidence was laid bare in court, the nation would come face to face with the darkest betrayal imaginable. A woman entrusted with innocence, who turned it into ash. In the autumn of 1921, Denmark gathered to witness one of the most extraordinary trials in its history. The courtroom in Copenhagen was crowded each day with journalists, grieving parents, curious citizens, and officials who wanted to see justice delivered. At the center of it all sat Dagmar Overbye, the quiet, ordinary-looking woman now accused of being a serial killer of infants. The charges against her were staggering. She stood accused of murdering 9 children, though prosecutors alleged she may have killed more than 25. The sheer scale of the accusations gripped the public. People struggled to reconcile the image of a middle-aged nanny with the horrors described in the newspapers. The trial lasted for 3 months, unfolding with a mixture of evidence, testimony, and shocking revelation. Witnesses took the stand. Mothers who described the last time they had seen their babies alive, neighbors who recalled the acrid smoke rising from Dagmar's chimney, police officers who recounted the grisly discoveries in her stove and in her home. One by one, the pieces formed a picture of systematic cruelty. But what unsettled observers most was Dagmar herself. Throughout the proceedings, she appeared calm, almost detached. While mothers in the gallery wept openly, Dagmar sat composed, rarely showing visible emotion. When asked directly about the charges, she gave conflicting responses, admitting some killings, denying others, and sometimes suggesting that the deaths were accidents. Psychologists and criminologists were brought in to examine her state of mind. Was she insane? Was she acting out of financial desperation? Or was she something colder? A woman without conscience, without empathy, who saw children as burdens to be erased. Experts debated fiercely. Some described her as suffering from mental illness, possibly rooted in trauma. Others argued she was simply calculating, a sociopath who exploited society's blind spots for her own ends. The prosecution pressed its case with grim determination. They presented the bones, the ashes, the testimonies, and the timelines. They reminded the court that these were not faceless statistics, but lives, infants whose first smiles, first cries, had been extinguished almost as soon as they began. The defense, meanwhile, argued for mercy. They suggested that poverty, desperation, and psychological strain had pushed Dagmar into madness. They asked whether society itself bore responsibility for abandoning vulnerable mothers, leaving women like Dagmar to fill the void with dangerous consequences. But for the public watching, mercy was in short supply. The outrage was overwhelming. Newspapers ran daily stories. Editorials condemned not only Dagmar, but the system of baby farming itself. The trial became a symbol, not only of individual evil, but of the dangers of unchecked trust. As the weeks dragged on, the verdict became clear. The jury found Dagmar Overbye guilty of murdering 9 infants. She was sentenced to death by beheading, the ultimate penalty under Danish law at the time. It was a historic decision. Never before had Denmark sentenced a woman to death for crimes of this scale, and yet even then, the sentence stirred controversy. Denmark had long been reluctant to carry out capital punishment, and many questioned whether executing a woman, no matter her crimes, was acceptable. In the end, her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. She would spend the rest of her days behind the cold walls of prison, stripped of freedom, denied the trust she had once abused so monstrously. But the damage she had caused could not be undone. For the mothers who had given her their children, there was no comfort. For the nation, there was no forgetting. Dagmar Overbye had stood trial not only for murder but for betrayal of the most sacred kind, the betrayal of innocence. When the gavel fell and Dagmar Overbye's sentence was announced, Denmark was left with more than just the memory of a sensational trial. The nation faced a reckoning. How had such crimes gone unnoticed for so long? And what did it say about the society that allowed them to happen? For ordinary citizens, the revelation was almost unbearable. In neighborhoods across Copenhagen, women whispered about the babysitter who had become a murderer. Mothers clutched their children closer. Fathers shook their heads in disbelief. The case dominated conversation, not because it was lurid, but because it violated something sacred. A mother can forgive poverty, forgive hunger, forgive illness, but how could anyone forgive the betrayal of a woman who took infants, held them in her arms, and then extinguished their lives? The newspapers fueled this outrage. Front pages called her the baby killer of Copenhagen, running illustrations of babies in cradles alongside grim headlines about murder. Reporters followed every detail of the case, from her calm demeanor in court to the ashes found in her stove. The public consumed it with horror, unable to look away, and when the verdict came, there was no sense of triumph, only a cold, lingering grief. But the aftermath of Dagmar's crimes was not confined to grief and anger. It prompted action. Politicians, officials, and social reformers recognized that what she had done was not possible without systemic failures. Denmark, like many European nations at the time, had turned a blind eye to the plight of unwed mothers and their children. Shame had driven countless women into secrecy. Poverty had forced them into desperate bargains. And lax oversight had allowed informal childcare and adoption networks to operate unchecked. In the wake of her trial, new reforms began to take shape. Danish lawmakers sought to strengthen the regulation of childcare services. Adoption procedures became more structured, requiring oversight by authorities rather than leaving arrangements to private agreements. Foster homes, once monitored loosely if at all, came under stricter supervision. The state accepted responsibility where once it had abdicated it. These reforms carried forward into the following decades, shaping the way Denmark, and indirectly other European nations, approached child welfare. Dagmar Overbye had shown in the most horrific way possible what could happen when vulnerable children were left unprotected. Her crimes forced society to admit that protecting children was not simply a private duty, but a public one. Yet while laws changed, questions lingered. The academic and criminological communities debated endlessly about Dagmar's motives. Was she a woman warped by circumstance, or was she something darker, an anomaly in human nature? Some argued that her own childhood hardships, poverty, possible neglect, the death of her own illegitimate child, had created a twisted psychology. They suggested she might have killed out of resentment, believing that if she could not have happiness through motherhood, no one else deserved it either. Others, however, saw calculation. To them, Dagmar was not a tragic figure, but a cold opportunist. She accepted money for infants she had no intention of raising or placing in adoption. Killing them quickly and disposing of the remains was, in this view, a practical decision, a way to profit without cost. This debate, between seeing her as victim of circumstance or pure predator, has never been resolved. It mirrors larger questions society often asks about criminals. Are they born evil, or made so by the world around them? With Dagmar, the line is blurred. Her time in prison provided little clarity. Reports describe her as quiet, withdrawn, and largely unremarkable during her incarceration. She did not make public confessions or explanations. She did not write memoirs or plead for forgiveness. She served her life sentence in near silence, as if retreating into herself. In May of 1929, at the age of 42, she died behind prison walls. Her death passed without fanfare. There was no great public reaction, no mourning. She was buried quietly, her life ending as bleakly as it had unfolded. But the silence of her death did not erase the echoes of her crimes. For decades, her name was invoked in discussions about childcare, trust, and evil. Parents used her story as a cautionary tale, a reminder that appearances can deceive, that vigilance is necessary even with those who seem respectable. In criminology textbooks and true crime studies, she became a case study in female serial killing, a rare but deeply disturbing phenomenon. Most of all, her legacy lived in the laws that changed after her trial. Denmark's stronger child protection policies were, in part, her unintended gift, a bitter inheritance for future generations. The infants who perished in her care did not die entirely in vain. Their loss illuminated the dangers of neglecting society's most vulnerable, and their memory helped ensure other children would not meet the same fate. Dagmar Overbye remains to this day one of Denmark's most infamous criminals. Her story is a reminder of the dangers that arise when desperation meets exploitation, when trust is misplaced, and when society fails to safeguard those who cannot protect themselves. And though nearly a century has passed, her shadow still lingers. She is remembered not only as a murderer but as a symbol of betrayal, a woman who twisted the role of caretaker into that of executioner. The story of Dagmar Overbye is one that still chills the heart more than a century later. It is not only the number of her victims that horrifies us, though even a single child lost is tragedy enough. It is the way she killed and the trust she exploited to do it. She took in children at the most vulnerable point of their lives, when their mother's arms released them in hope and in desperation. And then, behind closed doors, she extinguished those fragile lives with silence and calculation. Her crimes force us to ask, how do we make sense of evil that wears an ordinary face? Dagmar was not an outlaw roaming the countryside. She was not a figure of obvious menace. She was a neighbor, a caretaker, a woman trusted with innocence. The idea that such darkness could dwell within someone who appeared so ordinary unsettles us, because it strips away the illusion of safety. It reminds us that betrayal often comes not from strangers, but from those we choose to trust. Yet her story also reveals as much about society as it does about her. Poverty, shame, and the cruel stigma against unwed mothers created the desperate conditions that made Dagmar Overbye services seem like salvation. These mothers were not careless. They were cornered by a world that gave them almost no choices. In this sense, Dagmar's crimes are not only hers. They expose the failure of a society that turned its back on women and children, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation. And yet, even acknowledging that context, the question remains, why did Dagmar cross a line others did not? Many endured poverty and heartbreak, but they did not strangle or burn infants. Was Dagmar warped entirely by circumstance, or was there something within her, something colder, darker, that set her apart? It is here that we arrive at the most haunting question of all, and it is one I will leave with you. Do you believe Dagmar Overbye was a product of her circumstances, poverty, stigma, and trauma, or do you believe she was simply evil by nature, beyond redemption? Comment your thoughts below. This is a question that divides criminologists to this day, and your perspective matters. And if you found this story meaningful, please like this video, subscribe for more true crime documentaries, and share it with others who care about history's darkest lessons. Because remembering stories like these is more than morbid curiosity, it is a safeguard. It reminds us that the smallest lives must always be protected, and that trust once betrayed can never be taken lightly again.